A shiny black sedan pulled into the parking lot of a sleek office building as the early morning sun cast a golden glow on the glass facade. Inside the car, a man adjusted his tie nervously while glancing at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was familiar to the top executives and board members of the company, yet today, none of them would recognize him. He was the CEO, confident, powerful, and always in control. But today, he wasn't arriving as the boss. Today, he was stepping into the shoes of someone most employees barely noticed, the receptionist. For years, this man had built a reputation as a dynamic leader who could steer his company through tough markets and skyrocket its growth. But despite his achievements, something gnawed at him. He'd noticed the whispers of dissatisfaction during meetings, the way some employees avoided eye contact when he passed by, and the occasional anonymous complaint that landed on his desk. His gut told him there was more happening beneath the surface of his company, a culture forming that didn't align with the values he'd envisioned. Determined to uncover the truth, he made a bold decision. He would trade his tailored suits and corner office for a front desk and a uniform. No announcements, no grand gestures, just a disguise and a new name. He wanted to see the company not from the top looking down, but from the very foundation on which it stood. As he walked through the front doors, the usual hustle and bustle of the office felt different. He'd been here countless times, but this was the first time he wasn't greeted with deference or polite nods. Instead, his presence barely registered. Employees rushed past him, engrossed in conversations, juggling coffee cups and laptops. It was oddly liberating, but also unsettling. The morning started with a whirlwind of instructions from the outgoing receptionist. There were calls to transfer, visitors to greet, and an endless stream of emails to manage. The CEO quickly realized the role was far more demanding than he had imagined. Yet, it wasn't the workload that shocked him. It was how people treated the receptionist. "Hey, can you grab me a coffee while you're at it?" One manager barked as they breezed past. Another dropped a stack of papers on the desk without so much as a glance. "Sort these out by noon," they muttered before vanishing. The CEO kept his cool, masking his irritation. But inside, he was taking mental notes. This wasn't the culture he'd envisioned, a place where kindness and respect were non-negotiable. It wasn't just the managers, though. There were others, too, junior employees who greeted him with warm smiles and genuine questions about how his day was going. He saw both the good and the bad, and it painted a complicated picture. By lunchtime, he was already beginning to understand the unseen dynamics of his company. There were the overworked assistants who barely got credit for their efforts, the janitorial staff who worked tirelessly without acknowledgement, and the mid-level employees struggling to balance unrealistic expectations. And then there were the leaders, some of whom led with empathy, while others ruled with intimidation. One encounter, in particular, left him rattled. A junior employee approached the desk, visibly nervous, and asked for advice on a task. They confessed they didn't feel comfortable asking their supervisor, fearing ridicule. The CEO, still in his receptionist persona, offered guidance and words of encouragement. The gratitude in their eyes was undeniable, but their fear was equally heartbreaking. As the day turned into evening, the CEO sat at the reception desk, replaying the events of the day in his mind. He'd always believed his company was a reflection of his leadership, but now he wasn't so sure. How much of this culture had he unintentionally allowed to grow? How many employees felt unseen or undervalued because he hadn't taken the time to truly listen? He thought back to his own journey, the sacrifices, the mentors who believed in him, and the teams that had rallied behind his vision. He realized that somewhere along the way, the company had shifted its focus. It was no longer just about profits and market share. It was about the people, their experiences, their struggles, and their triumphs. But what could he do with this knowledge? How could he turn this undercover experiment into lasting change? He had answers to some questions, but new ones had surfaced, leaving him with an uneasy mix of determination and doubt. As he locked the doors that night, He glanced back at the empty office, wondering if the company he thought he knew so well could ever truly feel the same again. What he discovered next would leave him questioning everything he believed about leadership, trust, and the power of truly seeing people for who they are. But that's a story for another day. The next morning, the CEO arrived early, slipping into his receptionist role before the rest of the office filled with life. He'd barely slept the night before, his mind replaying the conversations and interactions he'd witnessed. Every word, every tone, every dismissive gesture seemed to echo louder in the quiet of his thoughts. This was his company, yet parts of it felt like a stranger's domain, a place where employees could feel invisible or undervalued, even while contributing to its success. The office slowly came to life as employees trickled in, coffee cups in hand, and weary faces suggesting the grind had already started before they stepped through the doors. From his seat at the desk, he saw everything: snippets of conversations, subtle power dynamics, and the unspoken hierarchy that played out in small ways. Some employees shared quick jokes and lighthearted exchanges, while others moved with their heads down, avoiding interaction altogether. One of the first people he encountered that day was a senior manager. They strolled in with an air of authority, barely acknowledging his presence as they muttered something about a package they were expecting. The CEO smiled politely, masking the growing sense of discomfort. The manager didn't even make eye contact, treating him as if he were invisible. It wasn't the first time he'd been overlooked in this role, but the sting of it never quite faded. Throughout the day, he began to notice patterns. The same people who ignored him often treated others similarly, their interactions marked by impatience or condescension. Yet there were others, employees who went out of their way to say a kind word or offer a smile. These moments of genuine humanity stood out like bright spots against an otherwise muted backdrop. Midway through the day, a young intern approached the desk, their face flushed with worry. They'd been tasked with organizing a presentation for a client, but were struggling to make sense of their supervisor's vague instructions. The CEO listened intently, offering suggestions and encouraging the intern to trust their instincts. As the conversation unfolded, it became clear that the intern's anxiety wasn't just about the task at hand. It was rooted in a fear of failure, a feeling that their contributions didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. The interaction stayed with him long after the intern walked away, their spirits visibly lifted. How many other employees felt this way, he wondered. How many walked into the office every day with untapped potential, only to be held back by a lack of support or recognition? It was a sobering thought, and one that deepened his resolve to see this experiment through. By the afternoon, the office was bustling with activity. Phone lines buzzed, keyboards clicked, and the hum of voices created a steady rhythm. Among the chaos, he noticed a junior employee struggling to carry a stack of binders. No one seemed to notice as the binders teetered precariously, threatening to spill onto the floor. Without hesitation, the CEO stepped out from behind the desk to help. The employee thanked him profusely, their relief palpable. "I wasn't sure anyone would stop," they admitted, their voice tinged with exhaustion. Moments like these revealed a deeper truth about the company's culture. There was a disconnect, a gap between the glossy image projected to clients and the everyday reality faced by employees. It wasn't just about policies or leadership styles. It was about the small moments that shaped the fabric of workplace life. The CEO couldn't help but feel a growing sense of responsibility. This wasn't just a company, it was a community. And like any community, it needed care and attention to thrive. As the day wound down, the CEO found himself reflecting on a conversation he'd overheard earlier. Two employees were discussing a recent project that had gone awry. While one of them was quick to place blame, the other took a more measured approach, suggesting ways the team could learn from the experience. It was a glimpse of the kind of leadership he'd always hoped to cultivate, a leadership rooted in empathy and collaboration. But it also raised questions about the gaps in his own leadership. Had he done enough to model these values? Or had he become so focused on the bigger picture that he'd lost sight of the people who made it all possible? Later that evening, as he locked up the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was only scratching the surface. Every interaction, every observation felt like a puzzle piece, hinting at a larger picture he had yet to fully understand. There were stories here, stories of ambition and frustration, of camaraderie and isolation. And within those stories lay the answers he was searching for. But with each passing day, the lines between his roles as CEO and receptionist began to blur. He found himself grappling with conflicting emotions, pride for the employees who embodied the company's values, and disappointment for the ways the culture had strayed from its roots. It was a strange, humbling experience to see his company through fresh eyes, to witness both its strengths and its flaws in such stark relief. What troubled him most was the growing realization that he might not have been as accessible as he'd thought. He'd always prided himself on having an open-door policy, yet few employees seemed to feel comfortable voicing their concerns. Had his position as CEO created an unintentional barrier? Or was it something deeper, a culture of fear or complacency that had taken root over time? The questions weighed heavily on him as he prepared for another day at the front desk. He knew he couldn't solve these problems overnight, but he also couldn't ignore them. This wasn't just about understanding his company. It was about understanding himself, his role as a leader, his impact on the culture, and his ability to create meaningful change. As he slipped into his receptionist persona once more, he couldn't help but wonder what new insights the day would bring. The mystery of his company's culture was far from solved, and the road ahead was anything but clear. But one thing was certain. He was determined to see this journey through, no matter where it led. What he discovered next would not only change his perception of the company, it would change him in ways he never could have anticipated. By the time the CEO entered the office the next day, a strange energy was building inside him. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but there was still so much he didn't know. He'd spent the night thinking about the countless voices and faces he'd encountered over the past few days. The quiet frustration of the intern, the cheerful resilience of the junior staff, the dismissive tone of some managers. All of it felt like a mirror reflecting back the state of the company. Yet there were shadows in that reflection, parts he still couldn't see clearly. The morning rush began as usual, with employees flooding through the doors, each one carrying their unique rhythm of stress and determination. From his seat at the desk, he noticed a few of the regular patterns: the polite greetings from some, the brusque commands from others, and the occasional jokes that lightened the mood. But today, something felt different. Whispers moved through the office like a current, subtle but undeniable. Employees huddled in corners, their voices low but urgent, glancing occasionally in his direction. It didn't take long for him to piece together the source of the murmurs. A major project deadline was looming, one tied to a high-profile client. Tensions were running high, and the cracks in the team's communication were becoming more apparent. Several employees approached the desk, each with small requests that hinted at deeper issues: misplaced documents, unclear directives, and last-minute changes that sent everyone scrambling. One employee, visibly frazzled, approached him with a frantic question about an issue. As he tried to help, she let slip a comment that froze him in his tracks. "Honestly, it feels like no one's in charge around here. Everyone's too afraid to say what's really going on." The weight of her words settled heavily on him. Was this how many of his employees felt? That there was no clear direction, no one they could turn to. The day spiraled further into chaos as tensions boiled over. Arguments broke out in the break room, harsh words exchanged between team members who were normally friendly. One manager stormed past the reception desk, muttering about unrealistic expectations and an ungrateful team. The CEO kept his expression neutral, but inside, a storm was brewing. He wanted to intervene, to remind them of the values the company was built on, but his undercover role held him back. He could only observe, taking mental notes and feeling a growing sense of urgency. As the afternoon wore on, he witnessed something that would stay with him long after the day ended. A junior employee, clearly overwhelmed, broke down in tears at their desk. While most people passed by without a second glance, one person stopped, a member of the janitorial staff. They leaned down, spoke softly to the employee, and offered a tissue. The kindness in their gesture was simple but profound. It was a stark reminder that leadership wasn't about titles or power. It was about compassion, about showing up for others in their moments of need. But the moment also highlighted a painful truth. The culture of the company was fractured. There were individuals who embodied the best of its values, but they were often overshadowed by the cracks in the system. The CEO couldn't ignore it any longer. The time for observing was nearing its end. He needed to act. That evening, as he locked up the office, the weight of the day pressed down on him. He stared out at the empty desks, the glow of computer screens still humming faintly in the dark. This was the heart of his company, the place where dreams were built and ambitions pursued. But it was also a place where people felt invisible, overworked, and unheard. He had come undercover to understand his company from the ground up, but now he was beginning to question if he could even fix what he'd found. How do you rebuild trust when it's been eroded? How do you inspire a team that's lost its way? And most importantly, how do you ensure that every person, no matter their role, feels valued? The next day promised to bring answers, or perhaps more questions. For now, all he could do was prepare for what lay ahead. Whatever the outcome, he knew one thing for certain. This experience would change him and his company forever. The CEO arrived earlier than usual the next morning, his thoughts clouded with the weight of what he'd seen and the questions still lingering. The quiet hum of the office at dawn felt different now, almost deceptive. From the outside, everything seemed orderly and efficient, but he knew better. Beneath the surface was a tangled web of unmet needs, miscommunication, and overlooked talent. He had hoped that the day might bring more clarity, but what unfolded instead left him more uncertain than ever. As he settled into his desk, the first visitor of the day arrived, a delivery person dropping off a thick envelope addressed to the executive team. While signing for it, his curiosity got the better of him. The bold lettering on the envelope caught his eye. Internal audit report. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't ordered an audit recently. Who had initiated this, and why hadn't he been informed? He placed the envelope to the side, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it an effort by the board to evaluate company performance, or perhaps a move by a faction within the leadership team to unearth hidden issues? The idea unsettled him, but he couldn't act on it without blowing his cover. For now, he would have to wait, his curiosity gnawing at him with every passing minute. The morning unfolded with an unusual tension. Employees seemed more guarded, their conversations quieter and filled with sideways glances. Something had shifted, though he couldn't yet pinpoint what it was. Then, just before lunch, he overheard a conversation near the break room that sent chills down his spine. Two managers were speaking in hushed tones, their words laced with frustration and thinly veiled anger. "I don't care what the audit says," one of them muttered. "If they think they're cutting my team, they've got another thing coming. We're already stretched too thin." "Tell me about it," the other replied. "But honestly, this could get messy. If they start trimming the budget, no one's safe, not even us." The CEO leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. Cuts? What cuts? He hadn't authorized anything of the sort, and the idea of layoffs or budget slashes being discussed without his knowledge made his stomach churn. If there was one thing he'd always try to avoid, it was the kind of top-down decisions that left employees blindsided and demoralized. The realization that these discussions were happening in secret filled him with a mix of anger and dread. As the day went on, the sense of unease grew stronger. Whispers spread through the office, and the usual buzz of productivity was replaced by a nervous energy. Employees avoided eye contact with one another, their movements hurried and tense. It was as if everyone knew something he didn't, and the lack of transparency only deepened his frustration. By mid-afternoon, A surprising visitor arrived at the reception desk, a member of the HR team. They looked around nervously before leaning in and speaking in a low voice. "Hey, I know this might seem weird," they began, "but have you noticed anything off lately? People have been acting strange, and there's this rumor going around about layoffs. Do you think it's true?" The CEO's mind raced as he tried to compose himself. He shook his head, feigning ignorance. "I'm not sure," he replied cautiously, "but I've definitely noticed the tension." The HR employee sighed, their shoulders sagging under the weight of their worry. "I just hope we're not heading for another restructuring. Morale's already low as it is." Their words lingered long after they walked away. Another restructuring. He hadn't approved any changes to the company's structure, yet the rumors suggested otherwise. Somewhere within his organization, decisions were being made without his input, and it was clear those decisions were beginning to take a toll on his employees. As the day neared its end, the CEO decided to dig deeper. He waited until the office was nearly empty before retrieving the envelope he'd set aside earlier. With a steady hand, he opened it, scanning the first few pages of the audit report. His heart sank as he read the findings. The report detailed issues he'd suspected but hadn't seen in such stark terms: inefficiencies in the management structure, gaps in communication, and a troubling disconnect between leadership and staff. But what struck him most was a section marked Proposed Solutions. The proposed solutions included cost-cutting measures that were more drastic than he could have imagined. Reducing staff, eliminating entire departments, and slashing budgets across the board. It was a blueprint for chaos, and the thought of implementing such changes without fully understanding their impact made his stomach turn. Then, at the bottom of the page, he noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. A signature. It wasn't his name, but it belonged to someone on the executive team. Someone he trusted. Someone who had been making decisions behind his back. The betrayal hit him like a punch to the gut. He had always prided himself on fostering a culture of trust and collaboration. Yet this report suggested that some of his closest allies were working against him. The implications were staggering. Was this about power, control, or something else entirely? And how deep did the deception run? As he stared at the report, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The cracks in the company's culture were no longer just cracks. They were fault lines threatening to tear everything apart. And now he was no longer just an observer. He was caught in the middle of a conflict that could change the company forever. The next steps would be critical, but they wouldn't be easy. He couldn't reveal his findings without exposing his undercover role, yet he couldn't stay silent as the company he built teetered on the edge of a crisis. The stakes had never been higher, and the path forward was shrouded in uncertainty. What he did next would determine not only the fate of the company, but also the legacy he would leave behind. The next morning, the CEO walked into the office with a determined focus, the weight of the audit report heavy on his mind. He felt like he was walking a tightrope, trying to balance his undercover role with the growing urgency to take control of the situation. The whispers about layoffs and restructuring had reached a fever pitch, and the tension in the office was palpable. He knew he couldn't let this spiral any further without intervening. He spent the morning observing more closely than ever. The employees were on edge, their conversations filled with speculation and fear. Even the usually cheerful receptionist team seemed subdued, their smiles forced as they greeted visitors. The CEO could see the cracks deepening in real time. It was time to act. By mid-morning, he stepped away from the reception desk under the pretense of running an errand. Instead, he made his way to the executive floor, a place he hadn't visited since starting his undercover experiment. The faces of his leadership team were a mix of surprise and confusion when he walked into their meeting unannounced. They hadn't expected to see him in his disguised role, much less with an envelope in hand. Without saying a word, he placed the audit report on the table. The room fell silent as they realized what it was. "I've read it," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Every word. And I want to know how this was put into motion without my approval." The executives exchanged uneasy glances, but it was clear from their reactions who had been involved. One of his most trusted senior leaders finally spoke up, their tone defensive. "We thought it was necessary. The company's facing challenges, and we didn't want to burden you with the details until we had a plan." The CEO's jaw tightened. "A plan? This isn't a plan. It's a demolition. Do you have any idea what this has done to morale? To the trust our employees have in this company?" Before they could respond, he continued, "I've spent the past few weeks as a receptionist. I've seen things you clearly haven't. Employees struggling to feel valued. Teams working without clear direction. And now, thanks to this report, a culture of fear spreading like wildfire. This isn't leadership. This is negligence." The room was stunned into silence, but the CEO wasn't finished. "If we're going to fix this, it starts here. Right now. No more secrets, no more backroom decisions. We need to rebuild trust from the ground up. And that means involving everyone, not just the people in this room." He paused, letting his words sink in. The tension was thick, but there was also a flicker of something else, understanding. Some of the executives nodded, their expressions shifting from defensiveness to realization. They hadn't fully grasped the impact of their actions until now. Just as the CEO thought the worst was over, his assistant entered the room with a worried look. "You need to see this," they said, handing him a tablet. On the screen was an email chain that had been leaked to several employees. It detailed the proposed restructuring plan and included disparaging comments about certain departments and individuals. The source of the leak was unknown, but the damage was immediate. The CEO felt a wave of frustration and disbelief. Someone within the company was actively working to undermine their efforts. He turned to the room, his voice steady but firm. "This is what happens when we lose sight of our values. Transparency is no longer optional. It's non-negotiable. From this moment forward, every employee will be part of the conversation about our future." He called an emergency all-staff meeting that afternoon, pulling everyone into the largest conference room, while others joined via video call. Standing at the front, still in his receptionist disguise, he revealed the truth. "I'm not who you think I am," he began, removing the glasses and jacket that had become part of his cover. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs as employees recognized him as their CEO. He explained why he had gone undercover, sharing the insights he'd gained and the issues he'd witnessed firsthand. "This company was built on a foundation of trust, collaboration, and respect," he said. "Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. But today, we begin to make things right, together." The employees listened intently as he outlined a new approach: open forums for feedback, greater transparency in decision-making, and a renewed focus on supporting every team member. He also promised accountability for the mistakes that had been made, starting with a restructuring of the executive team to ensure better alignment with the company's values. As the meeting came to a close, there was a palpable shift in the room. The fear and uncertainty that had hung over the office began to lift, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. The CEO knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that change was possible, if they worked together. But just as he was leaving the meeting, his assistant approached him with an update. "We've traced the email leak," they said, handing him a folder. Inside was a detailed report identifying the source. The same senior leader who had defended the audit report earlier that day. The betrayal cut deeper than anything else. This was someone he'd trusted, someone he'd considered a cornerstone of his leadership team. The CEO realized the twist wasn't just about uncovering who had leaked the email. It was about facing the fact that not everyone shared his vision for the company's future. He would have to make a difficult decision, one that would send a clear message to everyone. The company's values weren't just words, they were a commitment. The air in the CEO's office was heavy as he sat alone, the folder with the email leak report open on his desk. It had only been hours since the company-wide meeting, and while the energy in the office had shifted toward hope, the reality of what lay ahead was sobering. Trust had been broken, not just between leadership and employees, but among the leaders themselves. The betrayal by one of his closest executives was a wound that would take time to heal. After sitting in silence for several minutes, he made a decision. He called the executive in question into his office. They arrived quickly, their expression guarded, as if they already knew what this conversation would be about. The CEO didn't waste time. He placed the folder on the desk between them and spoke evenly. "I know you leaked the emails," he said. "I want to understand why." The executive hesitated, their shoulders sagging as the weight of the truth finally settled on them. "I didn't think you'd listen," they admitted. "I thought this was the only way to get you to see how bad things had gotten." The CEO leaned back, their words striking a nerve. "You thought betraying my trust was the best way to get my attention." "I thought it was the only way," they said quietly. The disconnect between leadership and the rest of the company has been growing for years. I tried to bring it up in meetings, but it always got brushed aside. When the audit report came in, I panicked. I thought drastic measures were the only solution. The CEO listened carefully, his emotions a mix of anger, disappointment, and a tinge of understanding. While the betrayal couldn't be excused, it was clear that desperation had driven their actions. He took a deep breath before responding. "I'm not going to pretend this didn't hurt," he said. "But I also recognize that I've played a role in creating the kind of environment where you felt this was your only option. That's on me. But going forward, I need leaders who can be part of the solution, not part of the problem. I can't keep you on the team." The executive nodded, their expression a mix of regret and resignation. "I understand," they said. "I hope you can turn things around." After they left, the CEO sat in silence, the room feeling emptier than before. He knew this decision was necessary, but it didn't make it any easier. Trust was the foundation of any team, and rebuilding it would require difficult choices like this one. Still, he felt a flicker of hope. The meeting earlier had shown him that his employees were willing to trust him again, as long as he earned it. Over the next few weeks, the changes began to take shape. The CEO held regular open forums where employees could share their concerns and ideas directly with leadership. He implemented anonymous feedback systems to ensure everyone felt safe speaking up. Transparency became a core principle, with leadership sharing updates on company decisions and financials regularly. One of the most transformative changes came when the CEO decided to bring back an employee-driven initiative that had been shelved years ago: cross-departmental mentorships. The idea was simple but powerful, pairing employees from different teams to foster collaboration and understanding. It wasn't just about professional growth, it was about rebuilding the human connections that had been lost in the hustle of daily work. The results were immediate and heartening. Employees who rarely interacted began forming bonds, sharing insights, and offering support. A junior marketing associate mentored by an IT specialist brought fresh ideas to a project that had stalled for months. A senior manager, inspired by their mentees' optimism, spearheaded a new wellness program that quickly became a favorite among employees. The CEO also made it a point to stay connected with the day-to-day operations of the company. While he couldn't stay undercover forever, he frequently visited different departments, sitting in on meetings and chatting with employees. These visits weren't just about visibility. They were about staying grounded, ensuring he never lost touch with the people who made the company what it was. One afternoon, while visiting the break room, he overheard a conversation between two employees. "You know, things feel different lately," one of them said. "It's like they actually care about what we think." The other employee nodded. "Yeah, I noticed that too. I mean, we've still got a long way to go, but it feels like we're moving in the right direction." The CEO smiled to himself as he left the room. Those were the kinds of conversations he wanted to hear, not because they praised him, but because they showed that the company's culture was beginning to heal. It was a long journey, and there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were on solid ground. Months later, the company celebrated its anniversary with an all-staff event. It was a chance to reflect on the past year, the challenges they'd faced, and the progress they'd made. The CEO took the stage to deliver a short speech, his voice steady as he looked out at the crowd. "This company has always been about more than just profits," he began. "It's about people, our employees, our customers, our communities. Over the past year, we've learned some hard lessons about what happens when we lose sight of that. But we've also learned how resilient we can be when we come together." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We're not perfect, and we never will be. But what matters is that we keep striving to be better, not just as a company, but as individuals. Thank you for believing in this vision and for holding me accountable to it." The room erupted in applause, a genuine expression of support and shared purpose. As the CEO stepped off the stage, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like they were walking it together. As the event wound down, he found himself standing by the window, watching employees laugh and chat. A member of the janitorial staff approached him, the same person he'd seen comforting a distressed colleague during his undercover days. "You did good," they said simply, a knowing smile on their face. The CEO nodded, his own smile growing. "We did good," he replied. In that moment, he realized that leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about listening, learning, and never forgetting the people who made it all possible. And with that thought, he turned back to join his team, ready to keep building the future, one step at a time.